The dorm was unusually quiet for a Friday night. Most of the guys had already left for the weekend, their voices fading down the hall hours ago. Even the distant sound of music from the neighboring rooms had gone silent, replaced by the low hum of the air conditioner and the occasional drip of a leaky faucet in the shared bathroom. I liked it this way. Peaceful, uninterrupted. It gave me space to think, to breathe, to be alone without the weight of eyes on me. I leaned back against the pillows, stretching my legs across the small twin bed, my laptop balanced on my thighs, open to a half-finished paper I had no motivation to finish. A bottle of water sat on my nightstand untouched. My roommate, Jake, was supposed to be out with his friends tonight. He had mentioned something about hitting up a party off campus, the kind of thing he always did. Loud music, cheap beer, girls hanging off his arm. The usual. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. Was it like I was jealous? Not really. I glanced at the empty side of the room, his side. His bed was still unmade, the covers pushed back in the messy way he always left them. A couple of T-shirts were thrown over his chair, and his cologne still lingered in the air, faint but familiar. It was stupid how much I noticed things like that. How much I noticed him. I tried not to. I had spent the entire semester convincing myself that whatever weird tension existed between us was just in my head. That the way he leaned in when he talked, the way he sat too close when we watched movies, the way his gaze sometimes lingered, none of it meant anything. Because Jake was straight, and I was just his roommate. I sighed and shut my laptop, deciding I needed a break. Maybe I'd grab a snack from the vending machine downstairs, stretch my legs a little. That's when I heard it. The door. It swung open suddenly, the sound cutting through the quiet. I looked up, expecting to see him stumbling and drunk, maybe mumbling something about forgetting his wallet or needing to crash early. But Jake wasn't drunk. He wasn't even breathing heavily, like he had run up the stairs. He just walked in and locked the door behind him. I frowned, my stomach twisting with something I couldn't name. "Hey," I said slowly. "I thought you were at the party." Jake didn't answer right away. His fingers lingered on the lock for a second longer than necessary before he finally turned to face me. His expression was unreadable. "I was," he said, his voice lower than usual. Didn't feel like staying. Something about the way he said it made the air in the room feel thicker. He didn't move, didn't throw his keys on the desk or kick off his shoes like he normally would. He just stood there, staring at me like he was trying to figure something out, like he had already figured something out. I swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of how small the room was, how close we were, how he had just locked the door. And for the first time since we moved in together, I realized I didn't know what Jake was thinking, but I was about to find out. The lock clicked into place, and the sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Jake stood by the door, his fingers still curled around the handle, like he wasn't sure whether to step forward or walk out. His jaw was tight, his usual relaxed posture replaced with something stiffer, more calculated. His hoodie hung loose over his frame, but I could see the way his shoulders were tense, like he was carrying something heavy. I sat up a little straighter, pressing my palms into the mattress. "You okay?" His gaze flicked to mine. There was something unreadable in his expression, something I hadn't seen before. Not confusion, not annoyance, something else. "Yeah," he said after a beat, though his voice wasn't convincing. He shifted, finally stepping away from the door and walking toward his side of the room. His movements were slower than usual, like he was overthinking each step. I watched him, my heart thudding a little too hard against my ribs. There was something off about him. "Why'd you leave the party?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Jake hesitated before sitting down on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped together. Wasn't feeling it. A vague answer, a non-answer. He wasn't looking at me. I forced out a chuckle. "That's a first." He smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, guess I just needed some air." He finally met my gaze then, and something in my stomach flipped. His expression was unreadable, his eyes darker in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. It felt like he wanted to say something, like there was a weight behind his stare, pressing down on both of us. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. I cleared my throat. Well, I was just gonna head downstairs, grab something to eat. You want anything? Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Nah, a pause. Then, sit down. I froze. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even casual. It was an instruction, a command. I hesitated for only a second before easing back down onto my bed. The air between us suddenly felt different, charged. My pulse was too fast, my palms a little too warm. I hated how aware I was of my own breathing. Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. I need to ask you something. My throat went dry. Okay. He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw it, something flickering behind his eyes. Doubt, hesitation, fear, and something else. He stopped, clenching his jaw before looking away again. Forget it. I blinked. What? Never mind. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. It's stupid. Now my chest was tight. The way he said it, the way his body tensed. It wasn't nothing. I wasn't imagining this. Jake, just say it. My voice was quieter now. He hesitated. His fingers twitched against his knees. Then, so softly I barely heard it. Have you ever thought about something so much it makes you sick? I swallowed hard. The way he said it, the way his voice wavered, I knew exactly what he meant. I just didn't know if I was ready to answer. Depends, I said, trying to keep my voice even. What are we talking about? Jake let out a humorless laugh. Forget it. No, I said, firmer this time. You don't get to bring that up and then drop it. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He still wasn't looking at me. Then, finally, you ever wonder what it'd be like? I frowned. What would be like? Jake clenched his jaw, his knuckles turning white, where they gripped the edge of the bed. Then, after a long pause, he turned to me, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his voice. Kissing a guy? My heart stopped. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Jake must have noticed because he let out another dry chuckle, shaking his head. Forget it, he muttered, standing up. I shouldn't have. Jake, my voice was barely a whisper. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. I swallowed hard, my pulse thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to say, what I could say, so I didn't think. I just moved. I stood up, closing the space between us in 2 slow steps. He still wasn't facing me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Look at me, I said, barely above a breath. Jake hesitated. Then finally he turned. The moment his eyes met mine, the tension in the room became unbearable. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. But everything had already changed. His breathing was uneven. His eyes flickered down to my lips, then back up. His fingers twitched at his sides. And I realized something terrifying. Jake wasn't just curious. He was struggling. Because this wasn't some fleeting thought to him. This was a battle. And he was losing. A breath caught in my throat. Jake. He cut me off. I don't know how to stop thinking about it. His voice was strained, his jaw tight. It's messing with my head. I swallowed hard. And if you stop fighting it. Jake's eyes darkened. The storm outside had picked up again, the rain hammering against the window pane. The air felt thick, suffocating, like the walls of the room had closed in on us. Then, before I could stop him, he reached forward, his fingers grazing mine. The touch was barely there. A feather-light brush, tentative, uncertain. But it was enough. Enough to shatter every unspoken rule we had been pretending to follow. Enough to make my breath hitch, my skin burn. Enough to tell me this wasn't just a mistake waiting to happen. This was something neither of us were ready to admit. Jake inhaled sharply, his fingers lingering against mine. Then, as if reality had slammed into him all at once, he pulled away, too fast, too suddenly. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his hands balled into fists. And just like that, the moment was gone. Jake exhaled, shaking his head like he was trying to snap himself out of something. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the bathroom, locking the door behind him, leaving me standing there, fingers still tingling, heart still racing, wondering what the hell had just happened, and what would happen next. The bathroom door stayed locked for what felt like an eternity. I sat on my bed, staring at the light glowing from underneath the door, listening to the sound of water running. It had been at least 20 minutes, but I knew Jake wasn't taking a shower. He was hiding. From himself. From me. From whatever the hell had just happened. My hands were still tingling where his fingers had brushed against mine, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his expression. The sheer panic in his eyes, the way his breath had hitched when I didn't pull away. This was more than curiosity, more than a mistake, and we both knew it. I exhaled, rubbing my hands over my face. I should let it go. Pretend nothing happened. Pretend I hadn't seen the way he looked at me. He was straight, right? He had always been straight. Except now. I wasn't so sure. The water shut off. I tensed, waiting, listening. The door didn't open right away. Another beat of silence stretched then. The lock clicked. I looked up just as Jake stepped out. His hair was damp, but his hoodie was still on, like he hadn't even bothered with a shower. His jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed as he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. He didn't look at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The tension sat between us, thick and suffocating, like we were standing at the edge of something neither of us had the nerve to acknowledge. Then, finally, "You're thinking about it too," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. I sucked in a breath. He lifted his gaze, locking onto mine, and I knew there was no going back now. I swallowed hard. "Jake," his jaw clenched. "Just answer me." I hesitated, and that was enough. Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head, running a hand through his hair. "Jesus," he muttered. "This is so fucked." I stood. "It doesn't have to be." His eyes snapped to mine, something desperate flickering there, something raw. "Doesn't it?" His voice was rough, strained. "Because I don't know what the hell I'm doing right now." Neither did I. But I knew one thing. I didn't want to lie. Not about this. I stepped forward, closing the space between us. Not too close. Not yet. "Then don't think," I said, voice steady even though my heart was hammering. "Just tell me what you want." Jake sucked in a sharp breath. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up again. His fingers twitched at his sides, his whole body tense, like he was waging a war inside himself. For a second, I thought he would walk away. But then, he moved, slowly, deliberately. One step, then another. My pulse skyrocketed. He was close now, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. The faint scent of his cologne mixed with the sharp freshness of the water droplets still clinging to his hair. His breath was uneven. So was mine. I swallowed. "Jake." He cut me off with the softest touch. His fingers barely grazed my wrist, hesitant, uncertain. A test. A question. I didn't pull away. That seemed to be all the answer he needed. Jake's fingers slid up, skimming over my forearm, his touch feather-light but electric. My skin burned under his fingertips, my body betraying every instinct telling me to tread carefully. And then he tilted his head, just slightly. His lips parted. My breath caught. The room spun. And in the fraction of a second before it happened, Before everything changed, his phone buzzed. Loud, sharp, a jolt of reality. Jake stiffened. The spell shattered. He stepped back, so fast you'd think I burned him. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his hands trembling at his sides. He blinked, like he was snapping himself out of something. Then, as if on autopilot, he yanked his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen. His jaw clenched. I already knew who it was. His girlfriend. I swallowed hard, my own pulse pounding in my ears. My body was still vibrating from the almost moment, my mind still trying to catch up with what nearly happened. Jake ran a hand over his face, exhaling. He stopped, shaking his head. I have to. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I already knew. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, heart hammering, hands shaking, wondering if I had just imagined everything, or if I had just lost him for good. The door shut behind him with a quiet click. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where he had just been, my breath still uneven. The air in the room was heavy, charged with everything that had almost happened. My skin still burned where his fingers had touched me. But now, the warmth was fading, replaced by a hollow ache in my chest. Jake was gone. Again. And this time, I didn't know if he was coming back. I sank onto the edge of my bed, running a hand over my face. My pulse was still erratic, my body still trying to process what just happened. What almost happened. Because for a second, he was going to kiss me. I knew it. I felt it. But then his phone buzzed, and reality came crashing down. His girlfriend. Of course. I exhaled sharply, gripping my sheets. Frustration, and something dangerously close to heartbreak tightening in my chest. I should have expected this. I should have known better. Jake wasn't mine. He was never mine. And yet, the way he had looked at me, the way his breath had hitched, the way his hands had trembled when he touched me, none of it made sense. Not if he was sure about who he was. Not if he was as straight as he always claimed to be. The worst part, I wasn't even mad at him. I was mad at myself. For hoping, for wanting, for letting myself believe, just for a second, that this could be something real. The room felt too small, too quiet. My stomach twisted as I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, trying to shove the memories away. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. The way he looked at me, the way he touched me, the way he ran. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Jake was nowhere to be found. His bed was empty, the blankets thrown back in a messy heap. His shoes were gone. His hoodie, his favorite one, the one he always wore when he was stressed, was missing from the chair. I checked my phone, but there were no messages from him. Nothing. I stared at the screen for a long time, debating whether to text him first. But what would I even say? Hey, about last night. I clenched my jaw and locked my phone. If he wanted to talk, he knew where to find me. Hours passed. I tried to distract myself, homework, music, anything, but it was useless. My mind kept circling back to him, to the way he looked before he walked out. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to be done, but I wasn't, and that was the problem. It wasn't until late that evening that I finally heard the door open. I froze, my pulse spiking as Jake stepped inside. He looked exhausted. His hair was a mess, his hoodie wrinkled like he had been wearing it all day. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look at me. I swallowed. Hey, a long pause. Then, hey, he muttered, voice rough. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. He still wasn't looking at me. I sat up, watching him. Where were you? Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Just needed to clear my head. I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Instead, he moved to his side of the room, sat on the edge of his bed, and buried his face in his hands. And for the first time since last night, I realized he wasn't just avoiding me. He was avoiding himself. I clenched my fists. Are we going to talk about it? Jake tensed. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. For the first time since he walked in, he met my eyes. And what I saw there, regret, guilt, fear, it made my stomach twist, because I already knew what he was about to say, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. Jake's gaze locked onto mine, and for a second, everything else faded. The world outside, the storm in my head, the ache in my chest, none of it mattered. Just him. Just this moment. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but no words came. I swallowed hard. Jake just... I can't. His voice was quiet. Final. Something in my chest cracked. I forced myself to stay still, to keep my expression neutral, even as the weight of his words settled over me like a slow-burning fire. You can't what? Jake exhaled, his fingers digging into his knees. I can't. He stopped, shook his head, exhaled sharply. I don't know what I'm doing, okay? I don't know what the hell this is or why it's messing me up so bad, but he ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. I can't lose you. My heart stuttered. He wasn't saying what I wanted him to say, but he wasn't not saying it either. I took a careful breath. Then talk to me. Jake clenched his jaw, shaking his head again. It's not that simple. Yeah, it is. I shot back, the words slipping out before I could stop them. You either want this or you don't. His eyes flashed. It's not that easy for me. Something sharp twisted inside me. Then what do you want? Silence. The air between us felt like a live wire, sparking, burning, waiting for something to break. Jake's breathing was uneven. His fingers twitched like he wanted to reach for me, but wouldn't let himself. He was caught between two versions of himself, the one who ran and the one who stayed. And I didn't know which one would win. Say something, I whispered. He looked at me. Then, before I could blink, he stood up, grabbed his keys, and moved toward the door. Panic flared in my chest. Jake, I need time, he muttered, voice rough. I need time. My stomach clenched. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to grab his wrist, pull him back, make him look at me, make him stay, make him choose. But I didn't, because I couldn't make that choice for him. So I let him go. The door opened. Jake hesitated, his back to me, shoulders rigid. And then, without another word, he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. And this time, I didn't know if he was coming back.